The news hit Canada like a thunderclap, across every television screen, every smartphone feed, and every trembling radio frequency. One headline dominated: Trump crushes Carney's economy, Canada on the brink. The shock wasn't just political theater, it was real, visceral, and devastating. Overnight, markets collapsed. The Canadian dollar plummeted against the U.S. greenback in a way not seen since the Great Depression. Grocery stores saw lines snaking out their doors, as panicked buyers stripped shelves of flour, rice, canned goods, anything that could last. It all began weeks earlier, when Donald Trump, back in power and louder than ever, announced a sweeping series of trade tariffs. Steel, lumber, dairy, pillars of Canadian exports were slammed with crushing taxes. Canada's been taking advantage of us for decades, Trump declared at a rally. His words broadcast live across both nations. No more. We're going to win so big you won't believe it. But for Canada, it wasn't just a policy shift. It was an economic earthquake. Mark Carney, once praised as a brilliant financial mind, suddenly looked like a man cornered in his own chess match. His carefully designed fiscal models, his promises of resiliency, and none could withstand the battering ram of American tariffs. The Bank of Canada scrambled, slashing interest rates and freezing capital reserves. But the damage was already unfolding in real time. Factories across Ontario announced mass layoffs. Alberta's oil sands, already teetering from environmental crackdowns, now faced suffocating restrictions on crude shipments south of the border. Even the prairies, with their endless fields of gold and wheat, were struck as new American farm subsidies undercut Canadian grain prices overnight. And in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, the mood turned electric with anxiety. On a cold morning in downtown Toronto, crowds gathered outside the headquarters of a major bank. Screens flashed the falling numbers of the TSX like a death countdown. An elderly man muttered to a stranger, "This is worse than '08. This is a broken bar survival now." But beyond the headlines and ticker tapes, the real story was unfolding inside kitchens, apartment hallways, and factory lunchrooms across the nation. Take the Shaw family, recent immigrants in Brampton. They had worked tirelessly, parents driving taxis and cleaning offices, their eldest daughter tutoring after school to save for a modest townhouse. But with interest rates slashed and banks tightening credit, their pre-approval vanished overnight. "Everything gone," Mr. Shaw whispered to his wife as their children listened silently, sensing the fear that no parent could mask. In Edmonton, oil worker Tyler McKay received his layoff notice with trembling hands. 15 years in the oil sands, and now a single printed page was all that remained of his livelihood. His wife tried to reassure him, but when their daughter asked if they could still afford her hockey lessons, Tyler broke down for the first time in years. And in Ottawa, protests began swelling outside Parliament Hill. Students, truckers, small business owners, they all chanted the same refrain: "Carney must go." The Prime Minister, already weakened by scandals, found himself cornered. Every question in Parliament circled back to the same point: how had Canada's leaders underestimated Trump's return? Why had they placed so much faith in Carney's economic playbook, which now seemed like a fragile house of cards? The country simmered with anger, but also with something darker: fear. Fear that Canada's decades-long reliance on its southern neighbor had finally reached a breaking point. Fear that the promises of globalization, once a source of pride, had become chains binding the nation's hands. Fear that the storm of nationalism, already roaring across the U.S., would spill northward. By week 2, the panic was no longer abstract. Gas prices doubled. Grocery bills surged. Small restaurants, already weakened by years of post-pandemic recovery, shuttered overnight. The once bustling streets of Vancouver's Chinatown were eerily quiet, as shopkeepers hung closed signs in windows they had kept open for generations. Still, Canada's spirit, the resilient, stubborn, and proud, wasn't ready to collapse. In community centres, people formed food banks. Farmers sold goods directly to neighbors, bypassing broken supply chains. Strangers pooled money to cover a family's rent or a senior's prescription. But even as Canadians clung to solidarity, the ground beneath them shook with each new headline from Washington. Trump boasted that America was winning big league while Canada begged for relief. He smirked at press conferences, declaring that the tariffs would stay until Canada played fair. And in a bitter twist, U.S. companies that once partnered with Canadian firms now cut ties, lured by the promise of Trump's tax breaks and subsidies. Mark Carney appeared on national television one night, his normally calm demeanor cracking under the weight of expectation. "We are facing extraordinary challenges," he admitted, his voice lower than usual. "But Canada is strong. We will adapt. We will endure." Yet in living rooms across the nation, his words fell flat. To a single mother staring at an empty fridge, or a retiree watching his pension evaporate, endurance felt like a cruel promise. As the third week dawned, a phrase began circulating on social media, whispered in frustration and despair: "Canada on the brink." It wasn't just a headline anymore, it was reality. Some whispered about boycotting American products, others dreamed of turning toward Europe, Asia, even China, for new alliances. But those were long-term visions, and Canada's crisis was immediate, gnawing, and merciless. In Winnipeg, at a town hall meeting, a young man stood up, voice shaking, and shouted, "How much longer do we have to suffer because of what happens in Washington? Are we even our own country anymore?" The silence that followed was heavier than any speech. Canada was standing at a cliff's edge, staring into an abyss shaped not only by Trump's tariffs but by decades of dependence. And as the world watched, holding its breath, the question lingered in the frozen northern air: would Canada fight or would it fight back? Snow fell over Ottawa like a shroud, masking the unrest brewing beneath. On the surface, Canada still looked to orderly clean streets, quiet suburbs, polite conversations in coffee shops. But inside, a storm raged. Protests had spread from Vancouver to Halifax. What began as small gatherings had grown into massive marches, with banners reading "Carney failed US and Canada first." Truckers parked rigs across major highways. Students camped outside Parliament Hill in tents, braving the bit cold. Even lifelong moderate asset teachers, nurses, shopkeepers were stepping into the streets. Mark Carney's government scrambled. Emergency economic packages were announced. Subsidies for farmers rushed through Parliament. New talks with Europe fast-tracked. But every policy seemed like a bucket of water tossed onto a raging fire. Then came the blow that pushed the country to its breaking point. Trump announced his North America Revival Act, a sweeping package of U.S. subsidies that lured away dozens of Canadian companies. Tech startups in Waterloo relocated overnight to Michigan. Auto plants in Windsor shuttered as their American partners cut ties. Even dairy producers in Quebec, once fiercely protected, found themselves crushed under the weight of American competition. The Canadian press called it the second annexation. Ordinary people called it betrayal. "We're bleeding jobs every day," cried a laid-off machinist during a live broadcast from Hamilton. "And Carney just keeps telling us to endure." "I'm done enduring." The opposition smelled blood. Their leader thundered in the House of Commons, declaring, "Carney has turned Canada into an economic colony of Washington. If he cannot stand up to Trump, then he does not deserve to stand at all." Parliament nearly erupted into chaos. The Speaker had to suspend sessions as MPs shouted across the floor, some calling for snap elections, others demanding Carney's resignation on the spot. Meanwhile, in the streets, whispers of something larger stirred. At a rally in Calgary, a woman named Aisha Khan, a former factory worker, grabbed a megaphone and shouted words that went viral across the nation. "Enough waiting for leaders to save us. We are Canada. If they can't fight for us, we will fight for ourselves." Her speech lit a fire. Neighborhood councils began forming. Farmers and truckers pooled resources to create independent supply chains. Tech workers launched grassroots cooperatives, determined to keep innovation within Canadian borders. What had begun as despair was transforming into defiance. But not all defiance was peaceful. In Montreal, a group calling themselves the Northern Patriots clashed violently with police, accusing the government of selling out to Washington. Their message was extremia border closures, trade shutdowns, total severance from the U.S.A. But it resonated with some of the most desperate citizens. The government teetered. The military was quietly put on alert. Foreign investors circled like vultures, speculating whether Canada's federation could withstand the pressure. International headlines screamed, "Will Canada break apart?" Then, a spark of hope. Leaders from Europe, alarmed by the crisis, extended an olive branch. A fast-track trade deal with the EU was proposed, promising billions in relief and new export markets. It wasn't a cure-all, but it was a lifeline. Canada had a chance to pivot away from its suffocating dependence on the US. But time was short. Carney faced a choice: cling to power and hope his scattered policies would hold up, or step aside for new leadership to steer Canada through the storm. On a freezing January night, with Parliament surrounded by protesters, Carney appeared on national television. His face was paled, his voice heavy. "My fellow Canadians, we are facing the greatest test of our generation. I have heard your cries, your anger, your pain, and I know that trust has been broken. Tonight, I announce that I will resign as Prime Minister, so that Canada may choose a new path forward." The nation held its breath. Then, as the announcement sank in, a strange thing happened. Cheers erupted in the streets. People hugged strangers, clapped, even wept. Not because their troubles were over, but because, for the first time in months, hope flickered again. Trump celebrated, crowing on American television, "We crushed Canada." Totally crushed them. But north of the border, something far more powerful had been born: a spirit of resilience, sharper now than it had ever been. Canada was still on the brink, but it was no longer helpless. Out of collapse, a movement had risen. Out of despair, determination. And as snow continued to fall on Parliament Hill, millions of Canadians whispered the same quiet vow: "We will not be broken.